So grab your Bible and head over to Joshua chapter 6. That's our reading for this week. Joshua chapter 6, and just some really unfamiliar territory. Y'all probably have never read this story before, right? Of all the stories in Joshua, maybe the most
Absolutely
well-known and memorable from when we were little kids.
VBS. We sing songs about
The
this.
walls came tumbling down.
Absolutely.
That's exactly right. Though it is an interesting telling of a story about a battle, right? Because that's really what this is now. We're taking the first city in the Promised Land, which is really kind of a big deal, but not a lot of focus on like fighting and warfare and battle.
No.
A lot of focus on the prep, and a lot of focus on, it seems to me, on this idea that God is the one giving the victory.
Right.
And that really takes us back to the end of 5. Do y'all remember that from last week? That Jeff didn't like the chapter break at 6? You really
Starts in verse 13.
You really wanted it up in chapter 5 and verse 13 because
that's when Joshua goes to, have his own look at Jericho, right. And, this mysterious, being shows up and describes himself, announces himself as the commander of the army of the Lord. And then is told, take off your sandals because it's holy here. So it implies it's God himself in some way. And so that's the whole thing is, the conquest of Jericho is really the coming of God and his army, so to speak. And that's why they just march around, the walls fall down famously, because this is God's conquest, which all the more I think highlights the tragedy of that first generation's faithlessness. We can't take the land. We're like grasshoppers in our sight.
Right.
Because literally God, the God who parted the sea, the God who Rahab admits to despise back in chapter 2, we're terrified of your God. We've heard of what he's done. We've, it now literally just show, this is what he would have done for the first generation, I think, right? Presumably. Would have shown up and handled it. There is no enemy that can stand before God. There's no wall that can stand before God. All they have to do is show up and walk, and that's the part of carrying the ark in front of them. Bring the presence of God, and God will handle it.
Yeah, because the walls are the big problem.
Oh, yeah.
You got to get past these huge impenetrable walls to be able to take the city. And in essence, God does all of that without any help from them at all.
Yeah. The hardest part, in some ways, the bloodiest part, because siege warfare could be really nasty. Yeah. And just, all you do is, and again, and part of the emphasis on the divine is the pattern of 6 and 7s, the number, 6 and 7.
You probably don't want to.
Probably
don't want to go down the 6-7 thing. That's a whole thing with the young people.
I know, but I'm sticking with what Scripture's doing here. Okay, so gotcha. God got the 6 and 7 first, 6 days in the 7th day, and and the 7 priests and 7 trumpets, and but yeah, just obviously emphasizing the divine nature of this action. And even in this symbolism of the numbers that God has selected of how they're doing this.
So watch it in the text, because chapter 6 and verse 2, God said, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand," right?
Yeah.
And then they get the instructions on how they're going to do this, and they set out doing it. And then 16, shout, for the Lord has given you the city, right?
Right.
And so there is that emphasis. And I think even in the design, the battle plan for this, that's the lesson.
Right.
You're not doing this. God is doing this for you. But then even when you get to the band, which is kind of the other interesting part of this, it gets so much of attention and sets us up for I that's coming later.
Right.
He says this is 6:17. The city shall be under ban. It and all that is in it belongs to the Lord. And then in 19, these things are holy to the Lord, for they shall go into the treasury of the Lord. So the Lord is the one conquering and giving the victory, and so the Lord gets the treasure at the end of all of it. All of it belongs to God.
Yeah. And so, and for the folks who are reading in a different translation, you've got the New American Standard there, the ban. ESV, I think, calls it devoted to destruction. It's a Hebrew word, haram. Which you still hear sometimes if you listen to news from the Middle East, and those Semitic languages, you'll hear that word pop up sometimes. But in the Old Testament context, the idea is that it's devoted to God through destruction. In this case, because remember all the way back in Genesis when God first promised Abram this land. and then Abram becomes Abraham. God tells Abraham it's not going to be yet because the iniquity of the Amorites not yet full. So there is a sense in which it's not just God giving the land to his people. It's also God's judgment on the inhabitants of the land for their sin. And so you have a mix of, in one sense, the first fruits. God gets the first substance of the land, but also the divine punishment for the iniquity of the Canaanites for all these generations that have finally had. God is. Why now? Because the iniquity of the Amorites apparently is full. And so God is also destroying them. And so that's the thing is, when you kill everything and everybody, you burn everything or otherwise put it in some sort of treasury, the whole idea is the people are not to profit off anything like that. And that concept of everything's devoted to destruction, to being given to God in some way, it's under the curse, under the ban, depending on your translation, that helps us understand why Achan has to die in the next chapter, the next chapter.
Right.
People wrestle with, even if why can't Achan just repent or say he's sorry or whatever? The idea is that by bringing again, different translations, different writers handle it differently, but the consecrated things that are consecrated to God for destruction, when he brought that into his tent, he made his tent part of Jericho and put it under the curse of Jericho. And so that's why, what was under his tent had to be destroyed now too, because it was devoted to the Lord's destruction, holy to the Lord for destruction. And so he could certainly repent, but he had brought the ban upon himself and his family when he did that.
So it's interesting that God goes to such great lengths to communicate to Israel that I am doing this and I am giving the victory. And I'm curious because that takes my mind in two different directions. One direction is that he wants them to have faith in him.
Sure.
Just like as they're traveling to Mount Sinai and the Promised Land the first time, God does all these things to show them, you can trust me. I can take care of you, right? I don't even need you to help me take care of you. I can literally bring water out of the rock, right?
Right.
And so from one angle, you have this message that you can trust me. You don't even need to do anything, and I can bring the walls down. On the other hand, it seems to me, too, there's a negative lesson about being arrogant because of your victories.
Yeah.
Don't look at this and say, oh, look at what I did.
Right.
You may have had a part in it.
Right.
But it is the Lord who was the one that gave the victory. So I'm wondering, is it one or the other, or is it maybe both ideas to help them trust or to keep them humble? What do you think about that?
Door number three,
Door
as
number
Randy
three.
Tomlinson would say.
To choose both.
Yeah, we're complex beings, and so I don't think you really have to choose them. I think all of that's at stake, and certainly in one sense, in the character of Israel over their history, you'll see both of those things being an issue.
Well,
because even to your point, even what you're saying, what you're asking, does remind me of a line from Deuteronomy, where God makes very clear when you're in the land, that I am going to give you. And you're enjoying the prosperity of the land. Do not think by your own hand, by your own strength, you've acquired this wealth. It's the Lord's doing that you're in this position in the first place. So don't ever kid yourselves that you guys have accomplished this or deserve this.
Yeah, the reason I wanted to bring up that idea is because I think that is a common human malady that we all fall to, and that is looking at we've accomplished and imagining that we have done this by our hand and by our wisdom and our street smarts or whatever, our education, and forgetting that whatever we've done, we've all done working with God's stuff.
Yeah. It's that old, we fall into the trap of thinking we deserve, whatever, because we've worked hard and pulled ourselves up by our own bootstraps, but we never stop and think about where the bootstraps came from.
That's exactly.
Just, at the end of the day, and certainly, the Lord wants us to work and, do whatever your hand finds to do it with all your might. But at the end of the day, the fact that there's a creation and the fact that I exist, that I live in it, is God's doing.
Yes.
My existence is the bootstraps I get to pull on even when I work hard. And my existence is a gift from God.
So let's at least touch on one other thing. And I'm thinking down at verse 21, because I think some folks will have a question about this, where we're told that they utterly destroyed everything, including men, women, young, and old.
Yeah.
And oddly enough, and I'm kind of offended at this as a man, if you just said they destroyed the men, I think everybody would be okay with that. I don't know why y'all are okay with that, right? But I think nobody would look on that and be troubled. But then the women, and we get a little squirmy, and then the young and the old added to that. The picture is that every person dies
Yeah.
in Jericho. And I think that folks that have a big problem with that, and that's a common objection to Christianity and what someone called the God of the Old Testament. He's a cruel and awful God,
Right.
and children are killed in this destruction. And so, what is the pushback against that objection? That God can't be a God that I would serve or believe in because He would allow children to be destroyed in a conquest like this.
Sure. I think you can answer that on three levels, and different
Three quick points.
Yeah, something like that. And I'm not sure that everybody will find all of these equally satisfactory, though I think they're all true. The first level, I think, especially a lot of people who haven't, learned to walk in faith with God would find acceptable, but I think it's still true, is the whole issue of what's right and wrong. In other words, defining justice. God's nature defines justice, not what we think justice should be.
Right.
And so we don't get, God's the one who's creating and saying it's good. So moral relativism sometimes starts rather, not just by determining, we get to decide what's right or wrong, but putting God under our microscope, putting God in the dock, and defining justice by what we think God should have done. So now but I think that's easier for people who've been walking by faith with God for a while.
How would you even object except for the moral standard that
Correct.
God is
the fact
given
that I
to
have
us?
a moral sense at all comes from God, and so I need to calibrate my sense of justice to what God does, not judge God by my counterfeit sense of justice.
Right.
But I think you got to get there. That's not where someone coming out of the world is going to be at. But I think that's one level. I think there's another level, kind of in between. Not quite as hard to hear as that, but still maybe a little bit more hard to hear. Is it in the Bible? And you talk about this is just how life works. Period. Is sometimes we suffer because we're part of a group that's suffering. I may not have chosen war, but if my nation loses a war, I suffer as a defeated nation. I mean, we sometimes suffer because of the group that we are a part of. And certainly in one sense, that's part of even in one way to frame how Jesus, the perfect human being, died. He didn't deserve to die, and on one level it was the will of God, but there's another sense in which he, by being born human in a fallen world, is subject to death, not because he sinned and deserved death. He's a member of a sinful group called the human race now. And so he is liable to death even in his innocence. He can be put to death because and again, goes back to God's wondrous grace, love, and mercy, that he would choose to participate in this predicament with us. He joined a group under the curse of death, and so was able to bear the curse of death, and then ironically didn't release us from it. But that's another sermon for another Sunday.
Yeah, the truth is, children die every single day, and you could raise the same objection.
And that's the point, because they are not personally sinful, they're innocent, but they are, as human beings, part of a group that is collectively sinful and under the curse of judgment because of that. And so then the third level is just, sometimes we look at it as a negative, but the reality is, to your point, if everybody's going to die anyways, whether you're 6 months old or 100 years old, if everybody's going to die anyways, and at the end of the day we all wind up before the judgment seat of God, we see it as a negative, whereas in the Bible sees the death of one who's right with the Lord as a blessing and a benefit because you go into the care of the Lord. Mm-hmm. And so we see them as losing, we get it all wrong. They missed out on living in a fallen world full of pain and suffering and eventual death. Those babies are safe in the arms of the Lord in their innocence now, whereas if they had grown up in a pagan world, they may well have followed their parents into paganism and been lost eternally. Yeah. We frame it all wrong sometimes.
Well, it's built on the assumption that there could not ever be any good reason for God choosing that path.
Right.
And I think you got to be really careful about
Agreed.
that. It kind of winds up being a potter and clay argument, right?
Yeah.
Where God's looking down there saying, hey, be quiet. I know what I'm doing.
That's right.
And I think that we have to open ourselves to the possibility that given the alternatives, God is actually doing the best, most loving thing. And I think, again, this gets back to our, the culture getting into us and faulty assumptions. But the worst thing to happen is not to die.
Yeah.
That's not the worst.
Right.
And I think people lose sight of that, and especially the death of a child. That's just the worst possible thing. Maybe we need to...
For those left behind, yes. But when we forget that, again, as Paul makes very clear in the New Testament, it is appointed for man once to die, and then comes the judgment. The goal is not your best life now and making it last as long as it can. The goal is to be saved and safe in the presence of the Lord. And when you put it in that perspective, those children missed out on this life.
Right.
Those children went from Jericho to the presence of the Lord.
And so one of the things I think that we ask the unbeliever who struggles with it is that question: could there be a circumstance where this was the better of the options?
Yeah, from when you frame it, but for the unbeliever, all they have is this life, and that's why it's an unjust tragedy.
Yeah, it changes everything.
When you're a believer, number one, exactly what Abraham said, that shall not the judge of the earth do what's right. I really need to recalibrate my sense of justice. But number two, from God's perspective, the goal is, the whole reason Jesus eventually comes anyways, the goal is to be saved and safe in his presence.
Yep.
That's the goal.
But the other part of this that I think is just fundamental is that not liking what God chooses to do here doesn't mean God doesn't exist.
Right.
And I think that's a mistake people often make. The evidence for God's existence is of a whole nother kind, another category. And the fact that I encounter something in the Bible that God does and I don't like may show ignorance and struggle on my part, rather than God doing something that I take exception to. And so if God exists, for which we have evidence, then what God does here is right. Why? Because he's God.
Right. Again, and I need to recalibrate my sense of what's going on.
If you want to have a further discussion about that, just text me and I'll provide Jeff's number for you. So you could happy for you guys to text him anytime, day or night. Talk about these kind of big questions. So Joshua 6, a lot to think about here. So we think about the Battle of Jericho. Think about what is here rather than what's missing, because not a lot about warfare, but a lot about what God's doing to say to his people, I'm the one that's doing
And it's
this.
a great story to talk to your kids about this week.
Yeah.